When reviewing the never-ending parade of top 100 lists and online reviews of the best games of all time, there's one game that stands out and is often mentioned in the same breath as Final Fantasy VII and The Legend of Zelda. That game is the venerable classic Chrono Trigger. As the industry began to usher in 3D and the new 32-bit console revolution began to emerge, Squaresoft released Chrono Trigger as a memorable storybook ending to the great console RPGs of the 16-bit era. While this was essentially a swan song for Square in the 16-bit and Nintendo era, it still remains one of the most emotionally resonant and intricately beautiful games ever produced. Developed by Square and a dream team of staff and creators, Chrono Trigger not only pushed the envelope of the Super Nintendo's capabilities through use of a 32-meg cartridge, but it also introduced gameplay elements and plot devices that would be found in later RPGs for generations to come. Final Fantasy creator and veteran Hironobu Sakaguchi acted as executive producer and supervisor of the game, along with Yuji Horii, the man made famous for the legendary Dragon Quest series. It was a landmark collaboration of the best that Squaresoft and Enix could offer, long before the eventual merger of the two companies. While Horii introduced the basic story structure of the game, the project also boasted the talents of Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu and character designer Akira Toriyama. While Uematsu came aboard in what was originally an advisory and supporting role, he later helped in composing many tracks of the extensive soundtrack. Much of the game's ambiance and memorable atmosphere is credit to the artwork of Akira Toriyama, who lent his familiar style ingrained in the Japanese pop culture psyche with his contributions to Dragon Ball Z. But most of all, necessary of any good RPG that sticks with the player for years to come, Chrono Trigger has scantily clad midget women. No, actually what's most important is setting the mood for the scantily clad fighting ladies. This is the soundtrack. Chrono Trigger does not disappoint. While Nobuo Uematsu and his influences can be heard throughout the score, most of the credit must be given to Yasunori Mitsuda, whose score is so expansive that the soundtrack was released as a 3-disc set in Japan. Though being Mitsuda's first job as a principal composer, it happens to be one of the most extensive in RPG history. The varying elements and settings of Chrono Trigger are captured with great effectiveness by the rookie composer, a feat not to be taken lightly considering the many settings and timeframes in which this game occurs. These very settings and timeframes bring us to the story of Chrono Trigger. This game still inspires discussion and references as anyone would have for an old film. Just as common as one would recall a favorite movie quote or scene, a hardcore gamer may say, "Remember when Frog was revealed to be the legendary hero who was called upon to defeat Magus?" Chrono Trigger, from the mind of Yuji Horii, is an adventure that spans many different time periods, intertwining the destinies and motives of the game's 7 main characters. Chrono, the game's protagonist, begins the game in what can be considered the present, 1000 AD, in the Kingdom of Guardia, just as the celebration of the new millennium kicks off. This story element did not go unnoticed, as it was a fitting homage to the real world preparing for the dawn of a new era. Not only a new era of video games as new consoles were coming, but also to the world of 1995 as everyone had already begun counting down the arrival of the 21st century. The plot follows an interwoven storyline of ancestry, evolution, and time travel plot points that, while more complex than even Back to the Future Part 2, they manage to be quite clearly portrayed through unprecedented character development. Each of your playable characters has complex histories and stories that introduce not only motivations for their actions, but also their feelings on why life is important regardless of the time period they live in. The game follows the characters Chrono, Luca, and Marle from 1000 AD, Frog from 600 AD, Robo from 2300 AD, Isla from 65 million BC, and Magus from 12,000 BC. Along with these playable characters are many more memorable people and places that help flesh out the main goal that unravels as these adventurers attempt to correct the elements disturbed in the timeline. As the story progresses, our team learns of the events that take place in the year 1999, the day of Lavos. Lavos, an extraterrestrial life form believed to have been living dormant under the Earth for millions of years, emerges that fateful day for reasons only later to be discovered. The gaggle of time-traveling friends decides then and there that it is their duty to save the world from destruction and correct the course of history for the good of humanity. It's quite an ambitious task which takes Chrono through the varying time periods of his world. The majestic and Fairytale World of 600 AD, the more modern 1000 AD with slight elements of a burgeoning industrial revolution, the prehistoric 65 million BC and the primitive race of humans battling the evolved reptites, the cold, harsh reality of the Dark Ages in 12,000 BC, and the dystopian wasteland that is 2300 AD. The world falls apart in 1999 and all life and evolutionary progress halts, keeping the world in a state of chaos and continuing destruction. These time travelers also come upon the end of time, a gateway to all time periods and a black hole in space and time held in order by the Guru of Time, a wise old man holding guard to the many pathways available. This mentor of sorts holds an almost existential insight and dominance over time's influence over the events and destinies of our main characters. The collective genius of Square and Enix together provided the dream team of legendary game makers who watched those on the front line of development. Chrono Trigger was produced by Kazuhiko Aoki and directed by Takashi Tokita, Yoshinori Kitase, and Ahiko Matsui. While the main story elements are developed by Yuji Horii, the general outline was developed by Masato Kato, and directors Kitase and Tokita helped develop the many side quests and story elements that would make Chrono Trigger an original contribution to the RPG genre and video games as a whole. Stay tuned for Retroware TV's continuing in-depth look at the brilliance of Chrono Trigger as we delve into the presentation and gameplay elements that make this game a shining example of the 16-bit era. We will look at why Chrono Trigger will live on as one of the greatest games of all time and how it continues to be a benchmark for all future RPG and adventure video games. We have looked at the game makers and designers of Chrono Trigger, but where does this game stand in the pantheon of gaming classics, and how has its variations and collectability made this game a fan favorite for almost 15 years? Retroware TV will take a deeper look into the Squaresoft classic Chrono Trigger. At the time of Chrono Trigger's release in 1995, the only non-Final Fantasy release in the US was Secret of Mana, and while a fantastic game, it was not an RPG in the sense of utilizing the common element of turn-based battles. Game releases by Square in the late 80s and early 90s were few and far between, while the Japanese market enjoyed many more titles available for their Super Famicoms, only a select few were released here. This was most likely due to the extensive regionalization and translation work that was required of text-heavy Squaresoft games. This was always an expensive endeavor, and considering RPGs were not big sellers prior to Final Fantasy VII, it wasn't the most profitable endeavor to undertake such heavy production budgets in an effort to support a limited release of a game that at the time was part of a genre considered to be too Japanese-centric for American audiences. Chrono Trigger, however, was a bestseller in the US. At the time, it was considered to be the greatest Square game ever released, and it sold quite well on the reputation garnered by the successes of the Final Fantasy series. For the classic gaming collectors, Chrono Trigger has become such a hot commodity that complete in-box sets, which include both maps and all the inserts, can fetch well over $150 on eBay. I know this because I sold my copy a couple years ago, something I've started to regret recently. At least I still have the pictures, right? The high price of this game, even loose as just the cartridge, is actually overinflated because Chrono Trigger is not a rare game. In fact, it was released in high quantities at the time of release. The Super Famicom version of the game is more readily available and cheaper to find complete in box. For some Japanese gamers eager to pick up the cartridge early in its release, were also lucky enough to get their hands on some collectible Prism cards that will fetch a high price if they can be found in the wild. Along with the official Japanese release, there was also a sampler ROM cartridge given out to reviewers and retailers in an effort to garner some interest in the game during its pre-release beta phase. Over the years, this ROM cart has been ripped and played, and suffice it to say, there are many slight differences as well as fundamental design pitfalls that don't allow you to progress normally throughout the game. Even earlier incarnations of Chrono Trigger's elements were also shown at the 1994 V-Jump Festival in Japan, prior to the release. Finding the ROM cart for sale is a bit more difficult, but it is a great item for true fans of Chrono Trigger. Upon working on this review, I also came across an incredible resource, updated constantly, that can shed light on this, as well as other elements of this game's history and development. ChronoCompendium.com. It is truly a fan's oasis to discuss and learn more about this game and its legacy. Along with the standard Super Famicom and Super Nintendo releases, there were also a few titles released on the Japanese-only Satellaview system. This was an add-on unit to the Super Famicom in Japan that allowed for game downloads via dial-up connection to a satellite server, thus the name Satellaview. The system never made it out of Japan and was not too successful there itself due to the price, limited content, and the small window of times throughout the day when downloads were actually available. The downloadable games on the Satellaview all had the prefix BS. This stood for Broadcast Satellaview, and most available content involved minigames and minimal content additions to existing titles and game franchises. For Chrono Trigger, Square released Jet Bike Special, which was a mini racing game featuring the jet bike sequence that takes place in 2300 AD. More interesting was a text-based graphical sequel to Chrono Trigger called Radical Dreamers. This is a little-known semi-sequel that was released a year after Chrono Trigger and helped tie up loose ends in the original game, while introducing new characters. The last two offerings in the BS library were the Chrono Trigger Character Library and the Chrono Trigger Music Library. Both of these small additions were eventually included in the PlayStation version of Chrono Trigger, released in Japan and in the US under the Final Fantasy Chronicles title. The PlayStation version included some really amazing anime cutscenes, and while it was a nice way to play the game, certain original color palettes and resolution lacked when translated to the new version. Along with those anime video sequences added for the PlayStation release, another lesser-known project was a 16-minute anime short film featuring characters and locations from the game itself. Along with the game footage preview, it was also shown at the V-Jump Festival as a promotional item for the upcoming release of the game. This anime short film poked fun at some of the game's themes and began with the preparation of the Millennial Fair showcase at the beginning of Chrono Trigger's story. It also featured game music utilized well throughout the entire anime short. Up until recently, a fan conversion project started, transforming the original Chrono Trigger into a fully realized 3D game. Chrono Trigger Resurrection was the title, and this talented group of fans really flexed their talents before they were shut down by Square a couple years back. While an understandable cease and desist order, it is truly a shame that some people didn't get the chance to play this labor of love. Simply by looking at images from the game in progress, the passion and effort taken to convert all aspects of the original locations and artwork into a fully realized three-dimensional landscape can easily be seen. Eventually, a true sequel was released for the PlayStation called Chrono Cross. Chrono Cross followed up where Radical Dreamers left off and helped flesh out that story by specifically utilizing some of the same characters. While Chrono Cross has received glowing reviews over the years, and it managed to hold true to some of the gameplay elements and settings that Chrono Trigger had originated, many fans of the original could never latch on to the sequel because of its new cast of characters. It goes without saying that the passion that Chrono Trigger fans have for the story and the game is an intense and well-deserved admiration. From the collectible rarities and the side stories hidden from most audiences, this game will live on for years to come. Stay tuned for the conclusion of Retroware TV's look at Chrono Trigger as we delve into the gameplay elements that made this role-playing game such an unforgettable classic. Chrono Trigger is without a doubt a classic and beautifully detailed game. Its production brought on one of the greatest collaborations in gaming history, and its presentation, history, and place in the hearts of retro gamers and collectors is undeniably secure for years to come. Retroware TV has taken a look at Chrono Trigger's history, story, and its place in gaming lore. But what about the real reason this game is unforgettable and influential in the video game world? The reason is, without a doubt, its gameplay. Chrono Trigger began like any other Square role-playing game. The main player's protagonist is introduced in a picturesque and fairy tale-like town environment, with various non-player characters providing information and plot-advancing pieces of the story. Unlike many RPGs, Chrono, your main character, is voiceless. All other characters you interact with throughout the game provide plot-driving dialogue, but your player is immersed in the story purely through personal experience. There is no fake voice to represent your adventure. Chrono's personality is effectively yours alone. The Fairytale World you are introduced to is quickly altered as you are steadily introduced to new technologies and the various settings of Chrono Trigger's multiple time periods. The norm of the classical medieval role-playing adventure setting with kingdoms and villages is turned on its head as you are introduced to various characteristics of different time periods. While the surroundings are different, the gameplay elements remain the same. There is a scaled-down overworld where your tiny on-screen character can walk or fly in the time ship Epic. You can travel to different areas of the overworld by this method. In this game, navigating the overworld in this fashion is completely safe, as no random encounters take place in the overworld. There are forests, towns, individual buildings and homes, as well as the ubiquitous caves, dungeons, and castles. In these more realistically scaled environments, you interact with people, creatures, and encounter enemies. A main difference in Chrono Trigger when compared to games like Final Fantasy, there are no random battles. All enemies, for the most part, can be seen on screen and in many cases can either be avoided or initiated when the party is ready. Of course, in some more tense and dangerous environments, enemies can definitely arrive unannounced, taking the party a bit off guard. This method ensures that the commonly unnecessary and annoying enemy encounters often plaguing RPGs can be avoided. Of course, battling enemies like in any RPG helps build the experience points and leveling attributes like strength, luck, speed, and defense. While this specific type of enemy encounter is similar to the adventure RPG genre, all fights are still turn-based, just without cutting to a separate battle screen. Everything takes place on the field map. Battles consist of physical attacks, magic attacks, and special attacks learned through increased leveling and depending on who you have in your party at the time. Magic and special attacks are called techs. These techs can sometimes be combined with other party members to create combinations of shared skills. Square employed the active time battle system for Chrono Trigger, similar to the one found in Final Fantasy IV. A timer indicates when your character is available to select an attack. In the beginning of the game, or in the subscreen, you can select whether the enemies prepare in an active versus wait system. You can only have 3 characters in your party at a time, and as you meet more, they can stay in place at the end of time and be switched out as needed at any point during the game. Because the battles are top-down and played on the actual movable field, your party members can occasionally switch their locations, allowing for better use of shared tech attacks. Games are saved at specific save points designated by a small starry field, and the saved games fall within named chapters that are selected at the start of a game. Chrono Trigger is unique in the way that it also allowed for the New Game Plus option, once the game has been beaten for the first time. The New Game Plus feature allows the player to restart the game from its beginning, allowing for the retention of all previously acquired experience, leveling, and items. Only gold and certain plot-driven items that are acquired are unavailable at the start of a New Game Plus. This little device allows you to have an easier time beating side quests, advancing through the game, and unlocking missed devices and story elements that can now be given more attention upon replay. This device was unique to Chrono Trigger, and pretty much was acceptable thematically, since starting the game again from the beginning with previously acquired experience lends itself almost naturally to the idea of time travel. This New Game Plus option eventually found its way to other Squaresoft games, like Vagrant Story, Parasite Eve, and Final Fantasy X-2. Another unique gameplay feature is that after some limited progression in the story, and because of the ability to travel through time, you can actually face the last boss of Chrono Trigger in his time frame of 1999 at almost any time of your choosing. Depending on when, how, and with which characters you defeat Lavos, you are introduced a unique ending sequence to the game. Small things you influence throughout the game as well as the larger ones, can significantly or minimally alter what occurs during your ending sequence. There are a total of 13 different endings in the game. This is of course if you include the bad ending, which plays out when you lose to Lavos. The multiple ending element creates a consistent replay value to Chrono Trigger. I have to say that now as we at Retroware TV wrap up this 3-part review, I have become even more enamored by this game. Its story, the well-developed cast of characters, and the gameplay innovations that have just been mentioned, it is a game worthy of being picked up, rediscovered, and investigated again and again. The irony is that this game is timeless, not just because of its quality, but because of its time-traveling aspects. These story experiences can be rediscovered again and again. Thank you for watching Retroware TV's visit to the world of Chrono Trigger. It harkens back to the video game era of the mid-90s, and it shows the beginning of the budding RPG popularity in America. Chrono Trigger's unique elements and qualities helped redefine the genre and helped urge future designers to push games in new directions. From Medina to Guardia, from your Super Nintendo to the end of time, Chrono Trigger will always live in the hearts of classic gamers.